Welcome to another episode of the Future Money Podcast. In this episode, I want to introduce you to one of our newest hosts. It's somebody you might have known already because she's been in our community for more than 5 years. It's Sabine Scheller. She's the engineering manager at the Interledger Foundation. And she's always been interested in data ownership and the Internet of Value. But today, it's not about us hosts, but it's about Joran, the founder and CEO of Tiger Beetle. And in this episode, we'll dive deeper into his background in business and coding, and of course his journey from Cape Town towards leading a global team. A group of people whose collective aim is to revolutionize financial transactions.
Hey Level, thanks for having me, and pleasure to be here with you all. And my name is Joran. I'm a founder and CEO of Tiger Beetle. A little bit about me, I've always loved business, and since I was a kid, I was on the playground, providing marbles or all kinds of things. And I've always loved this idea of creating something to serve, to make an impact and make things that people want. And along the way, I got into coding, and I've always loved coding. So I'm a self-taught programmer, and I got into computer science research and self-taught and all those papers. And so I've always loved business, always loved coding. I happen to be from a corner of the world that is close to Antarctica, which is Cape Town. And in my head, I work all around the world. I work mostly in the States, but most of my team are there. And I guess I love music and kite surfing. We could talk more about that.
Actually, what I really want to know is your marble game. I'm sorry. It really fascinated me about you talking about the fact that you had an interest in business and, selling marbles or collecting the marbles?
Yeah, selling marbles. Well, actually, I used to sell insurance for the marble games. So people would play marbles. The problem that people were facing, this was their big pain, was that someone would win a marble game, and in winning it, they would sometimes play with these big iron marbles and damage and smash the glass marbles. So you would win the game, but the marble that you actually win is broken. So what I used to do was I would sell insurance. So, depending on who won, you would get a whole new marble that you win. I can't remember how I worked out the economics, but there was insurance on the playground in terms of marbles. And it made marbles better because you win a game and now you don't get a broken marble, but you get something new. There's a whole story there, all the many different business things. But I guess the biggest learning that I ever had was that business is really all about trust. And that is what makes business happen, is trust. And trust is a wonderful thing. If it's there, things move so much quicker. There's more velocity. Everything gets better. The more trust there is, it unlocks business. So that took me a long time to learn, but that was the biggest learning through all those years of running, whether it was selling computers, whether when I was older, building websites for people, doing events and interesting things. It was always like at the end of the day, it came down to trust. If people trust you, they will ask you to do things for them and happy to pay you to do that. And that's business.
So if you are so passionate about business, why did you decide to start a company like Tiger Beetle that is more techy? And why did you decide to make it that global?
Yes, so I think this comes to why do we decide what careers we go into? My father's an architect, so I grew up learning, loving, appreciating architecture. He used to teach me things like form follows function, and these amazing things like how do people move through a building, circulation. Like a building is like the human body. There's circulation, and people are moving through it because they have a job to do, or the building performs a purpose in society. And so he taught me all these lessons, and we really connect today on these things. And design is how it works, and architecture, and what is art. So architecture is wonderful because it brings engineering together with art, clearly and obviously. It just has to be. So why software and technology? Well, to me, it was what I realized was that if you go into architecture, the beautiful thing is that what you make, it almost lives forever, because these buildings, that you design, they live on. And so you have so much responsibility in what you create, but also they do live on, which is nice. It doesn't, software is different because you create it and a year later it's out of date or it's a bit rotten, But the nice thing I appreciated with software was that you can make stuff and you don't need the raw materials. You don't need cranes, you don't need bricks, you don't need a team of civil engineers and all the other engineers and quantity surveyors. And it's like the movie Inception. You can go and be an architect in this invisible world and create things, and you don't have to pay for the raw materials, which means that you can be like I was, 11 years old. You can take books out of the school library and teach yourself to code and start building these. It's like you're building your own Minecraft, and anyone can do it. Like Ratatouille, anyone can cook. But coding is actually more true because you don't even pay for your groceries. You just need somewhere you can type and write code and you can create things. So you can be an architect in an invisible world. That attracted me. And then the other thing that attracted was business, because you can really change people's lives and let them do things through technology. It's a real enabler. And again, it's highly scalable. So like a small team of people can change the world and let them communicate or create platforms where people have jobs. And you don't need a lot to do it. So that was always what inspired me for technology. Both of those, you can create and you can serve, and you need very little to do that.
So for our listeners who've never heard of TigerBeetle or of what is an accounting database, can you explain it a little bit better?
Yeah, so TigerBeetle is a financial transactions database. What are financial transactions? It's just another way of saying, let's do business. So if you're a kid in the playground selling marbles, that's a transaction. The marble moves from Andile to Bongani. So it's a debit credit in the accounting sense, but someone is losing the marble and someone is getting it. And that is a business or financial transaction. It's a marble transaction, but it could be gold, gold marbles or steel marbles or just cash or insurance. But these are all transactions all around us. So if you go into the mall and you tap your phone, that's a transaction. If you receive your paycheck, it's a transaction. If you buy some stock, in a company, that's even a transaction. It's a big transaction. So everything we do, if you book an Uber driver, that's a transaction. You book a seat on a plane, it's a transaction. In a cinema, transaction. So TigerBeetle is a financial transactions database, and that means that it is the engine that any kind of business would use to record the transactions they do. As you do business, you're doing transactions. But it's not even for business, it's for foundations. As people donate money, that is a transaction, and you record that. So the whole world really, I think, revolves around trust, and goods and services and time move from one person or place to another. And that flow of things or information or value, that's all transactions. And in this digital world, that is all around us, you need systems to record these transactions. And so that's what TigerBeetle does as a database.
I would love to hear more details. But before we go there, is your marble selling game, was that the inspiration, or what was the inspiration for TigerBeetle?
Okay, so when I was 11, I got into coding and I loved it. And I realized here's this whole new world, create things, no raw materials. You're an architect, and it's this movie Inception, and you're building things. So I always knew I wanted to go into business. It was my passion, entrepreneur. My grandfather immigrated from the Netherlands and he built up a business. My father had his own business. So that's always what I love doing, is to serve people honorably at a profit. Business, but great business definition. Like the world always has these holes everywhere, and society needs them to be filled by nonprofits or by businesses. So we have bakeries because it makes sense that someone should get up at 4 a.m. in the morning and bake bread for the community. That makes a lot of sense. So the community needs that to exist. So you have these needs everywhere, and that is why these things, should arise, is to serve those needs. So this is macroeconomic, the thinking, what does the world need? And what I saw, I was quite lucky. I was just playing soccer on a field and I bumped into someone who was working on Interledger. And I said, wow, that sounds cool, Interledger protocol, because it's connecting systems together that transactions can happen. And I didn't really know much about payment systems or financial transactions at that point. But what I did know is I always had this passion for business. And because of that passion, I had an engineering scholarship, but I actually gave it up. And the reason why I gave it up, not to go into like engineering or coding, was it was so that I could study financial accounting. And the reason was because someone said to me, these debit credits are how you record marble transactions, and all the transactions of the world are really debit credit, something moving from one place or person to another. And so I had this background that the way businesses can be expressed on paper in the real world and the way it is done for centuries in every country virtually is debit credit, double entry accounting. It's like the first law of thermodynamics. Money cannot be created nor destroyed, but merely moves from one account to another. And so I had this background, and that's why I studied that. And so I had this love of coding, love of business, and the love of the business schema, debit credit. And then, just lucky to be consulting, as it happened, together with Interledger and Coil, like on the Bill and Melinda Gates central bank payment switch, or a central bank switch, which is called Mojaloop. And that switch is really just doing debit credit at a national scale. Like, you've got banks, those banks have got users or people, and those people want to send money, from Andile to Mongani. And at some point that is being recorded and the money is moving from bank to bank. It's these little debit credits happening. And so looking at this system and then seeing how they were building it. And what was interesting was they weren't using a transactions database. Well, they were using what historically people thought was, but they were really using a general purpose engine, a general purpose database to record transactions. And this database wasn't giving you the debit credits. It was giving SQL queries. And so you had to do a lot of work as a developer before you could even just put transactions through the database. And that was why the whole switch was being built. So then looking at this problem, you see two problems. The first is that there's an impedance mismatch. So people want to record business transactions or non-profit transactions, everyday transactions of life through the switch with debit credit. But the database to power this doesn't speak this language. It speaks a much lower level language that is takes a lot of work to get right on top. And that's also slow, because now there was this sort of limit to how fast the switch could possibly go, because all the performance didn't matter how much hardware you gave the general purpose database, how many machines, the performance was just fundamentally capped. And from there came TigerBeetle. Let's make a financial transactions database with that background of coding, background of debit credit. Let's just create an engine that you can drop into a car and suddenly it goes 1,000 times faster, because the engine is powering the car in the right way. It was meant for this.
So making sure that you get debits and credits right on a traditional database is very hard. But when you build your database from scratch, you also need to make sure that this is rock solid. So how do you ensure that fault tolerance and the high availability on TigerBeetle?
What a question. That's exactly the problem. And I think also what's interesting is it's not enough to be as safe as existing databases either. You can't just say to people, look, we're as safe as the status quo, because then there's some incentive to change, but people will also look at you and say, you think you're as safe. So actually you need to be 10 times safer. But there's also an opportunity there. So here's the context is that the general purpose database powering most systems today, most business transactions, it's either Postgres number 1, MySQL number 2, or SQLite number 3. The number 1 and 2 on the podium there are both 30 years old, give or take a year. So they're 1995, 1996. And if you think of it that way, you're like, wow, iPhones didn't exist back then. There's been so much research in computer science in the last 30 years. Hardware has changed. We've got cloud didn't exist back then. NVMe drives didn't exist back then. the scale of the world today, the volume of transactions was, in the last 7 years alone, in many sectors, the scale has increased 1,000 times to 10,000 times. So that's even in the last 7 years. And even the cloud databases, they were designed mostly 2012, so 12 years ago. But when you look at the most popular open source general purpose databases, they're 30 years old. And the world has just changed. That was the 90s, the years of Smashing Pumpkins, one of my favorite bands. So much great music. You can sort of figure out, with your coworkers. I've got fantastic coworkers, and it's awesome to see, depending on our age difference, have they heard that song by Blur, Song 2? And they've never heard it before. And then you put it on and they're hearing this amazing hit single for the first time, and it's going to be amazing. So I guess in musical terms, 30 years is not a long time, but in technology terms, it's like an eternity. So we got so much more research into how to design safer systems. The hardware has changed. And so if you want to build an engine today, you're not going to make an internal combustion engine. You're going to make an electric engine. It's electric vehicle, actually. There is no engine. So everything has fundamentally changed in how you would build a financial transactions database or engine today. You would build it totally differently. And so kind of this is the opportunity we had, was that, yes, these databases are tried and tested. No, they don't use, there's 30 years of research since then that they just don't have. And so our systems today are suffering because they're not using state-of-the-art infrastructure. And I think the time has come, because of where the world is going with scale, that to just keep up, you have to reset things. And so TigerBeetle was very much, how can we design to be 10 times safer? But actually you can, because it's all there in the research on how to do it, how to test it. There's new ways to test. So old databases are very much, let's write millions of lines of test code by hand. Today with TigerBeetle, we do autonomous testing. So we spin up 100 CPU cores and they simulate TigerBeetle. They actually accelerate time, run TigerBeetle in a simulator, like a flight simulator, so that you're not, in the past, databases are like, let's learn to fly for real. And you're like, ooh, now, now this pilot is going to learn by getting in the plane with people in the plane, and that's how you learn. And that's a hard way to learn, and obviously you don't. But that is how the history of databases. That's how you learn. You flew the thing for real. And these days, there's 3 databases in the world that do this: Foundation DB, Apple's Cassandra, and TigerBeetle. There's new techniques now that we use where you create a flight simulator and you run the database in there and accelerate time. And if you crash, it's fine. No one gets hurt. It's simulated. But to do that, you have to design the whole database to be tested like this. So that's how we did it for TigerBeetle.
So you said that TigerBeetle is inspired by research, and I do know a little bit about that research that went into TigerBeetle. And maybe this is getting a bit nerdy now, but can you tell us a little bit about the basis of TigerBeetle?
Yeah, let's nerd out, Sabine. So we're going to go deep here. We're going to rabbit hole, to the ends of the earth and out to space and back again. So this is the other interesting thing, is that a lot of databases that are 30 years old, they were designed before what is called a consensus protocol. So what I mean is, in those days, you got your software on a stiffy disk, and if you played games, you ran your game on one computer. And if you wanted to play games with someone else, they had to be in the same room with you, and you had to connect via Ethernet cable. And that's how you played games. And there was no concept of that you can play games with someone around the world, or that we can have a chat like this around the world. But how come we're not in the same room connected via Ethernet cable, But we don't need to be. There's the internet. I guess there's a story there for Interledger, like what Interledger is doing for payments, what the internet did for networks. But hopefully we come to that. And then since that time, of the 90s, already in the 80s, the research was there, but people didn't really know it. And that research was 88. It was called view stamp replication. And it came out of MIT. It was Brian Oakey under Barbara Liskov, who was a Turing Award winner. And this research was, how do we create software that runs across more than one machine simultaneously? So software that can run, like you can make a data center and make a data center a computer, or you can take 3 data centers and make them look like one computer. Because if you can do that, a data center can disconnect from the grid or have power loss or be destroyed, unfortunately, or something could happen. But you have now 2 other data centers still, and you're still running. So to the rest of the world, it's like, wow, this software is running across computers, across networks, even across data centers. So it's highly reliable. But now that research is called a consensus protocol. That's how you do it. And it's probably one of the coolest algorithms in computer science for me. And it's also kind of like the Everest, because to implement these algorithms is very hard. So because it's software that runs across computers in real time. Like actually multiplayer games are even cooler and harder, because they've been doing this for years, since those days of Ethernet. But view stamp replication was the first pioneering consensus protocol. A year later, Paxos came out by Leslie Lamport, very much influenced, I think, by view stamp replication. And then years later, 2012, view stamp replication was revised by Barbara Liskov, James Carling at MIT. And then 2 years later, Raft came out, which is very popular. And Raft was more or less view stamp replication. The names were changed and a few things were like oversimplified, I think, to make it for teaching purposes. And you'll see the Raft paper, credits view stamp replication, that it's so similar. So really underneath all these consensus protocols, the original is view stamp replication. And so that's why for TigerBeetle, we wanted TigerBeetle to run across data centers, because it's, people's money is so critical. These 30-year-old systems, they're a single machine. Yes, you can make backups, but they don't do the backups in real time. So if you lose a machine, you are going to lose some portion of people's money, or you're going to have downtime. You can't have both because they don't have a consensus protocol. So for TigerBeetle, the hard decision was like, we actually need to climb Everest and go and get ourselves one of these consensus protocols and do it for TigerBeetle. So you can run a few beetles around the world and you can't take them out. It's very, very reliable. And that's why we have the simulator, that you can simulate, how to get this algorithm right. But that's really kind of what TigerBeetle gives you, is you don't need to use proprietary cloud software or cloud database that you can only run in one cloud provider. TigerBeetle is open source software you can run across multiple clouds all over. So Amazon can go down and you're still running, and then Amazon comes back and Google goes down and you're still running. But you can do this kind of like high availability with TigerBeetle. So that's why we needed a consensus protocol and why we specifically picked view stamp replication, just to kind of pay tribute to that pioneer. And it was the one that was most intuitive.
Hey there, listeners. You're tuned into the Future Money Podcast, where we explore everything related to digital financial inclusion. I'm Aisha Ware, Program Manager at the Interledger Foundation, and we've got something exciting for you. But before we dive back into the episode, I wanted to share a project I was involved in collaboration with Carolyn Malachi and students at Howard University Advanced Audio Production course. The course is a capstone for seniors in the audio sequence. It is designed to challenge students to develop long-form audio productions, including podcasts, audiobooks, film scores, and more. Through this project, students created interstitials about Interledger for our podcast. Here's a sample from Elijah Kirksey, a 2023 graduate of Howard University. Stay tuned.
Are you ready to be a part of something revolutionary? Welcome to the Interledger Summit, a global gathering of people transforming the future of digital finance through open technology. It brings together innovators, regulators, and everyday individuals to bridge the gap in financial services. Join us as we hear from the trailblazers who are changing the game. From community problem solvers to visionary artists, everyone has a voice in building a more inclusive world. It's more than an event. It's a chance to build new connections, spark conversations, and collaborate on ideas that have the power to transform lives. Don't miss out on this opportunity to be a part of something transformative. Visit interledger.org/summit to learn more and discover how digital finance can empower everyone, everywhere.
Thanks for listening to Elijah Sample. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
So you need a consensus algorithm to get everything global in sync. You also have a global team. How do you get that in sync? And how far are you on your journey up the Everest together with that team?
In a way, it always feels like we're at base camp, which is a nice place to be, Actually, one of the team has been to Everest Base Camp. Yeah. So
Wow.
so that's Gian on our team. She's been there, done Kilimanjaro as well. So kind of, this is the thing, is like how you design your team also impacts what you produce together. So from the beginning, we've kind of thought, well, TigerBeetle came out of this open source project that was meant for the whole world, and it is meant for the whole world. Mojaloop, and Interledger as well, that goes with it. And so we were like, well, TigerBeetle is open source like these projects, and it's meant for everyone because you want to power new things. So the team to build TigerBeetle is also global and distributed like the database. So that's our focus, that we're all over. So half the team are in the US or in Brazil, but on Eastern time, and the other half are on London time in Europe. Only 2 of us actually in Cape Town. 1/8 of the team here, and the rest are all over. But then we also learn more. We get diversity of thought and craft. And I mean, we can even just talk to people, because a lot of the people that we talk to are, on certain time zones. So you're in the same time zone.
It's not a question concerning your team, but mostly it's more of a future-focused question. How do you believe that TigerBeetle has been contributing to shaping the ecosystem, so the fintech industry and beyond? And do you have a long-term vision on how it will shape the current ecosystem?
I think this was the thing, that we felt, is everyone is building their financial transactions database. So this goes back also to Sabine's question, like, we're actually always building a database. It's just a question of, do we realize that or not? Are we doing it intentionally or not? And coming to your question level of, how this contributes and will contribute. But I think this is what we saw, is that the central bank switch was building a financial transactions database. It had to do all the work around the general purpose database that the general purpose database didn't do. Now you do it around that. But that system is a database, but it's not built to database standards. And so we thought, well, let's do this explicitly. Let's make a financial transactions database, but let's share this cost. So we'll do it. We'll make it open source, and it's for the world. Everyone can use it. And now this problem, this hole in the world of every single business has to reinvent its financial transactions database. And many people have done this. And I've chatted to people, they thought, yeah, we were thinking we're going to go and build TigerBeetle. And we saw, hey, you built it, thank you. So now, like, what happens is it's not only Mojaloop, not only Interledger, but it's many projects that are starting to build on TigerBeetle as critical infrastructure. And it's open source, which is the beauty of those, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite. They're the top 3 because they're open source, and they have stayed open source. And so going forward, I think the way we see it is that TigerBeetle it's about making a technical contribution, giving people a financial transactions database designed for mission critical safety performance, resetting performance, going for 1,000x more performance, which we also designed for. There's a whole story there. But all of this is about looking to the next 30 years or so. So we've received 30 years of open source. Each generation, it's up to us to do something, And I think at some point, like, we've had this from Michael Stonebreaker, people who did amazing things with Postgres, 30 years of open source. And at some point, each generation, I think, can take it on, that we're like, well, let's do something for the next 30 years in turn. And that's the beauty of open source.
What I really loved at the beginning of our conversation is that you were comparing what is the engineering profession to architecture, architects actually, because they are the shapers of society, because of the influence they have with the city mapping. So do you believe that a system such as what you're building right now, it being open source, could follow that pathway as well? Or could have that influence? I know it's a lot to say over your own products, but I'm just curious about that.
Thank you for saying it. No, I agree with you. That's one thing I learned from my dad as well, is that you do, with architecture, you have a wonderful opportunity and responsibility, and things like, how do we design schools? There was this thing, where sometimes people would separate communities. So the elderly lived isolated, which is a terrible thing. And far nicer things that my dad worked on were, how can we integrate so that the young can learn from the wisdom of the old, and the elderly can be energized by the energy of the youth and have joy, and because that's real community when it's integrated. So I don't know for Tiger Beetle, but I think the one thing that we do try is we try to give people the financial transactions primitive, so a rich set of ways of doing debit credit. It's not just a debit credit, it's debit credit, and maybe you do it now pending, and then later on you post it as confirmed because you're interacting with other systems. So it's like debit credit at the intersection of distributed systems. So we try to give people these primitives to make what was previously very hard, even impossible to do. We try to make it possible out of the box. But here's the thing, is that we try also to not do things. And this is another architectural principle from Christopher Alexander. It's like you almost want to wait. If you're designing like a university campus, you don't want to lay the brick paths. Wait. Let the students in, let them walk everywhere. And then afterwards at night, you go in and look and you see now where is the grass worn, because that's probably where we should put the path, and it's not where we expected. So Tiger Beetle, we try to minimize surface area. So we try to make impossible things possible, hard things easy. But there's always a temptation that you try to do too much. You try to not only provide primitives, but you try to provide whole features. And so we try not to do that. And we try to say, look, we'll give people the double entry accounting primitives, but not the policy, not the accounting policy. That should stay with the coder. We let them make the policy decisions. We'll provide the safe primitives to record those decisions of debit credit. So if you book a ride, maybe there's the transaction with the driver, there's the route transaction, there's the tip transaction, there's partnership transactions. But the policies around that, we don't take that on. So we separate accounting policy from accounting primitives. And the reason is that policy changes across jurisdictions, it changes across business to business or entity to entity, foundation to foundation. It even changes from teams. Different products have different policies that they need. And I think this is key that I learned, but previously, like the core banking systems, they tend to do not only the debit credit primitives, but also the policy. So they mix it all together. And over time, it becomes more and more inflexible because now the paths are in the grass where the students no longer walk. And so I don't know if this is a good enough answer to what is a great question, but this is just what we try. This is what we're responsible for, and actively look, we don't want this. This is for the world to figure out.
No, I think it's a great answer. The reason why I asked the question was basically because in the end, you're building something that could potentially be extremely influential, but also there's a layer of direction, but also power into it. Yes. If you do it on purpose or not on purpose, especially if it's open source and people are using it, which is incredible. And I love the entire connection about the responsibility as well.
Yes. No, thank you, Lovell. And maybe I can just add as well, I love the question. So this is why open source is so important, because I saw there were some technical projects that I really, really loved, like ZFS. And unfortunately, around just as it happened with ZFS as a file system, in a way, it had very similar properties to Tiger Beetle, that it can survive disks that are failing, and it was a big inspiration. But just because of the history of how things worked, and the licensing around ZFS was never clear. And so it was pretty much open, but because the licensing wasn't clear, it never got used, but therefore it never really served because it was the world's most incredible file system. People are starting to use it, but for years we lost out. And so I kind of, with TigerBeetle, I think, and if you look to, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, these technologies are infrastructure and they're too valuable not to be open source. And so I think some people think that open source and being sustainable are at odds, that you need to force people or you need to try to be a monopoly, and that's business. And I actually think that is not business. Business, again, comes back to trust. And open source is the best way to build trust, that this is for everybody and it's not locked up. So that's why, and intentional, when people contribute code to TigerBeetle, there is no CLA agreement so that it stays open source. We can't relicense those contributions, but it's intentional, because if you mess up the license, it will die. No one will use it. And so that's kind of the thing that always saddens me when I see projects that were once flourishing open source. They change the license because they don't really understand the business, I think, and they don't see that business is a healthy ecosystem. There is competition. There's all these things, and in so doing, they actually destroy the business, the value that could have been there. Like Interledger is open source. Moduloop, the only way they can use TigerBeetle is that it is open source, and we don't want our transaction systems to be beholden to one company or cloud provider or be proprietary. The core infrastructure must be open. And actually, I think a lot of core infrastructure for the last 30 years hasn't been open. So I'm kind of curious to see what happens if it is. You could either buy this or you could use the open source stuff and build it. But now what if we can give people this engine? And this will be exciting to see.
Well, as you know, at the foundation, everything is open source too. We believe that this is the only way that other people can learn from what we're building. And I feel like that's also your mantra that you live by. But I also feel like there was a performance story that you were very eager to tell us. So tell us about TigerBeetle performance.
So this is what I learned, again, with Interledger, Coil, Moduloop, is that the world is becoming more transactional. And it's kind of, lately I've been thinking of this as like a TV. So the last few decades, if you look at the dimensions, like let's get our ruler out and measure the dimensions of the TV screen. It hasn't changed too much. Cinema screens, like the room size, maybe it's changed a little bit, but the dimensions of the screen haven't really changed. And what's the thing that's really changed? It's the pixels of our computer screens have gotten so much smaller. They're invisible to the human eye. I remember when the pixels were green and black and big, and you could see a pixel. and today, like with transactions, you can see transactions. You can't do a transaction if it's less than $5. Otherwise, you really see it. You also feel it with the fees. But what I love with Interledger is that it's asking the question of, the world is becoming more transactional. The dimensions of like GDP or whatever is maybe staying more or less the same, gradually increasing, but the resolution of transactions is greatly increasing. So pixels are becoming smaller. We're moving to a world of like 4K color with what you can do and create on top of these payment systems, because the resolution is so much better. Like, I think next year already, maybe people are going to pinch themselves and ask each other, can you believe that we used to wait a day for a payment to go, within a country, or a day? Can you believe that? Can you remember that time, when we used to buy albums? Or even, can you remember that time when you used to buy songs? Because, music has become more transactional, high resolution. Like now you don't even think of buying a song. You just stream. It's seconds. And so streaming is coming to payments, very much so. But what that means is now you need more powerful TVs to drive 4K color displays. You need performance, TigerBeetle. And so like the pixels are becoming 1,000 times smaller, literally. Like in the world of energy, one of the first TigerBeetle users is an energy utility. They realized that we're moving to clean energy away from coal. If you're using coal, You maybe bill your customers as an energy utility, you bill them once a month. So if you've got 1 million customers, you've got 1 million transactions once a month. If you move to clean energy and solar, the price of energy is now following the sun, which is changing all the time. It rises and sets day and night, but it's even changing with cloud conditions, weather conditions, clear skies this side, even though it's winter. But the price of energy is changing all the time. So this energy provider, what they realize is like, wow, okay, instead of pricing clean energy once a month, let's price it every 30 minutes, because that way we can give people more efficient energy. Like now, why should you overpay for your energy just because your provider isn't being transactional with you? Like you should be able to pay for energy every 30 minutes. And that, going from once a month to every 30 is literally 1,440x increase in volume. So that energy company is making their sector 1,440x more transactional. The pixels are smaller and more frequent. And so suddenly you're saying to your infrastructure, I need you to drive the car, please, 1,000 times faster. And the driver is like, this car is not spec'd for that. And so we designed TigerBeetle. We just redesigned the whole thing. Before, with general purpose SQL, you would send a lot of SQL queries back and forth over the network, half a millisecond each trip. And that would mean that you've got this fundamental limit because of rollouts. You can do 100, maybe 1,000 transactions a second, business transactions. TigerBeetle, we realized that's a problem. It's like putting one person in the plane, from Amsterdam to Newark, and then the plane goes back to get the next person. But it's even worse than that. It's like let the plane go back and forth 10 times, and now you've moved one person. That is a financial transaction of a general purpose database. It's let the plane go back and forth 10 times, and on the 10th trip, let the person finally commit and go across. And we were like, this doesn't make sense. Like, because for the CPU, it's actually worse than that for the CPU. It's like, let's go to Mars and back 10 times because CPUs are so fast and networks are so slow. The speed of light in fiber is a constant, never going to change. So we were like, let's put 100 people in the plane and send them in one trip. And then you've done 100 debit credit transactions because the seats speak debit credit. It's not like some other language. And then we were like, okay, well, let's not stop here. Let's put 8,000 people in the plane. That's going to be cool. And we'll do one plane trip, 8,000. That is the key for TigerBeetle's performance is we change the protocol, higher level primitives, and we pack 8,000 of them in one network request. So one plane trip is 8,000. And now you can have planes coming from all over the world into Schiphol and to Newark. And now the airport is also better for the airport because it's not just one person each 10th of a trip, or each 10 trips. So now everything gets better. And so it's very simple. We didn't really do anything special. It was just trying to solve the problem. So
it's actually a good example. I do have a question because you mentioned, for example, the transaction cost as well. What does digital financial inclusion mean to you? Because it's something that's very close to the hearts of the people who work, or at least for the Interledger and the people who work for the Interledger Foundation. And if you think about the transaction cost, but also the latency, like what does it mean to you?
It's a question we ask as a team. We say, who will never ever know about TigerBeetle? And it'll be like the people who have for them, it's everything. It's their week's wages and they've sent it back home. And that money never gets locked up for manual reconciliation, that they don't have to spend 50% of it on fees. Those will be the people that will never know about TigerBeetle because hopefully they will never have that experience anymore. So for us, it's very, very important. Who will never know about this? And let's just do our job right, that the system never breaks, never locks up people's money. And we're kind of lucky as a team because we have a very narrow product surface area. What I mean is the reason we exist as a group of people, to the hole that we have to fill is a very clearly defined, and we've just gone deep and we just haven't stopped drilling. And things like this question of financial inclusion and who is is never going to know about Tiger Beetle because things just work, because the infrastructure can power it and it's cheap and efficient. We take it for granted. It's like electricity. There was a time when electricity was so expensive that one person in America could afford it. Just one. There was only one person, and now it's like electricity, like switching lights on is cheaper than candles. But there was a time when it was the other way around. And so it would be nice that, we make these things so cheap that people take it for granted. But when you do that, a whole lot of other things become possible. So this is kind of how, just to let you in on how we think about it, but it's why we really care, because there's so many little things that can go wrong with computers, like the quartz crystals that track time in a computer can drift. As the machines heat up in a data center, the clock can tick faster, according to the heat slightly. And so some machines start to go faster. This doesn't impact the consensus or anything, the correctness of the system. But if you zoom out and think of who's actually using this in Asia, in Africa, in South America, in North America, in Europe, who's using this, there it's very important that money moves between systems or doesn't move. But a lot of that has got to do with time, because you will say to another partner on the network, like, this money should move, and within a certain amount of time, it should move back if something went wrong. So if you get those times wrong, it can happen that like a clock jumps a year into the future. And so someone's money is locked up for a year. And now that's really, really bad, because it might be something that, that for them is going to change everything. So we go really deep into like the hardware and the software. And that's why we designed a whole database, because you kind of have to, all these things are co-designed to specialize for who's the end user and how do we optimize their total cost of ownership, not how quickly can we make a database. Once we have shipped it, let's rather like ship it a month later, because we want to optimize for 10 years, 20 years of the people using it.
So as you know, our Interledger Summit is coming up, and that's also all under the umbrella of digital financial inclusion. And a lot of the end users will be there. So what are you most excited about? Because I know you're going to be there because it's in Cape Town. So it's around the corner for you.
Yeah, I'm going to be there, and the whole team are going to be there. Like, they're all coming out as well for the summit. So I'm really excited. We're a small beetle, but there's a few beetles, and they all coming to Cape Town. And we're really excited to meet everyone, because that's kind of what it's all about. So we say, like, do things in the most direct way possible. And it's great to just get everybody right up with the community, like who's using this, and also learn and understand, because that's why it exists. So how can we improve? Yeah, and it's kind of, I guess, we all encourage one another. It's these things are happening. It is happening, and it is moving. It's not only Interledger or Tiger Beetle or Mojali, but it's happening all around the world. So it's quite exciting to see. It's a real trend, the real-time trend, and it's spreading everywhere, which enables financial inclusion.
And I've heard that you're also sponsoring the hackathon.
Yes, yeah, we are. I mean, Interledger is our big brother and big sister, actually. I've got 3 older siblings, and they're my sisters. So I'm the little brother, and but Interledger is that for us too, I guess. And so Interledger is doing this hackathon, and we're just like coming in. And if people use Tiger Beetle, then most creative use of Tiger Beetle, or the most performant, then there will be prizes. Yeah. So thank you for having us, that we can be there, because it's pretty awesome to. This is what makes things worthwhile is how it's used. So there's nothing like a hackathon, for people to actually hack with the stuff. So.
I agree. So we have now one question left, and it's actually a question we ask all of our guests, and it's based on, kind of like predicting the future of finance or digital finance. And we ask our guests to give us their thoughts on what they believe the 30 years, maybe 50 years will be. You don't have to reference, or you don't have to think about flying cars or what is it, Back to the Future types of, maybe we could. But if you think about the future of the world and the future of finance, what direction, or what would you like to envision?
Oh, thank you, Lovell. How did you know this is what I'm speaking about at the summit?
I didn't,
You
really?
you didn't.
Okay.
But
No.
actually, my talk is how do we predict the future, literally.
Oh,
And I haven't told anyone this. So I guess, let me give us a teaser trailer. So uh, Nicholas, I think Nassim Taleb, he said, prediction, not narration, is the test of understanding. So can you predict something? And being able to predict is a better test of understanding than narration. Everyone's a storyteller these days, but who can predict? So I'm glad you asked this question, And then now, I mean, predicting the future, that's hard because, it hasn't happened yet. How do you predict the future? And I mean, you didn't prepare me for this question, but you can see I'm
sorry.
prepared for my talk. This is my talk, but a little teaser. So how do you predict the future? Hasn't happened yet. And Alan Kay, he's a jazz musician. He's also a computer scientist. He said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And now we need to ask ourselves, okay, so it's important to predict. How do you predict? You need to invent. Next question, how do you invent? And then that great inventor, Thomas Edison, he said, well, I look at what the world needs, and then I proceed to invent. So he wasn't a great inventor so much, he was a great archaeologist of needs. He could find the needs and just serve those needs, and you'll be an inventor in passing, I think. So what is the next 30 years of fintech? I think we have to look at what the world needs, and then we need to see, what are the goals to serve those needs? What's the methodology to hit those goals? And that's kind of the Tiger Beetle story. I think the world is definitely not going to want slower, buggier databases. It's going to want them to be 1,000 times faster already. We're actually concerned that we're not giving enough performance because some sectors are already 10,000x. We've only designed for 1,000x. So it's kind of like the world is going to need faster infrastructure because you can trade that performance for cost efficiency. It's going to be wanting to run multi-cloud by default. I'm talking to my area, but for fintech, I think regulators are going to say, they're already saying, you can't only be running on one of three providers because that provider goes down and a third of the country goes down. So open source is going to be critical, that we're not locked in and infrastructure becomes commodity. It has to be commodity and utility. The future is going to be faster, safer, better, I hope. At least that's what that's what we're all here for as a generation, isn't it? So, and then our kids will look back at us and say, 30 years ago, there was this database called Tiger Beetle. It's too slow.
Thank you so much for answering this question. We're at the end of the podcast, so I really want to thank you for joining the Future Money podcast and being one of our guests. And looking forward into what is meeting you guys at the hackathon, but also at the summit, because then when we all get together. So thank you, Joran. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to you for having me, and also Interledger Foundation, because it's also changed my life. Financial inclusion, like you've brought me in. I was doing other kinds of coding, and this is now so much more exciting. So I also want to say thank you.
If you would like to learn more about Joran Greef's vision of the future, then you have two options. Either join us at the Interledger Summit on the 26th and 27th of October in Cape Town, South Africa, where he will present the next 30 years of transaction processing, or you can watch the live recording of his presentation on the Interledger YouTube page.
Hey, it's Aisha again. We wanted to remind you that we are nearing the Interledger Summit. Join the Open Payments movement, where a global community of changemakers is reimagining the future of digital financial systems. We want to welcome you to our pre-summit activities, the IOP Hackathon on October 19th and October 20th, and our Community Open House on October 25th. Our official summit will kick off on October 26th with a dynamic schedule of inspiring speakers and engaging sessions. We hope you'll join us in Cape Town.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Future Money podcast. And of course, make sure to subscribe and like our podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to your pods.